Hi everybody, welcome to our conversation today. We're going to be talking about race and the church. So this is our first episode and it's titled, What Does Racism Look Like Today and Why Are We Talking About It? So just to introduce ourselves before we start, I'm Abby. I'm a second year medical student in Cardiff. Kim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Kim and I'm also a second year medical student in Cardiff.
Hi, I'm Melissa and I'm a second year law student in Cardiff.
And where are you at the moment, Melissa?
I'm currently in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Hey.
Okay, so just to get the conversation started, the first question is, what is the point in us having this conversation today?
Well, I guess to kind of kickstart, it's a long overdue conversation, if we're honest. The church's goal overall is unity when we think about it. It's about unifying as one body of Christ. And we have a responsibility to act when we see any kind of forms of injustice happening in the world. So that is the main point that we are having this conversation, to just get real, raw, vulnerable, and honest with one another about the dynamics in the church at the moment to do with race and culture, and just talk some productive points on efforts that we can be making as part of the body of Christ.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think another reason is because the truth of the matter is God cares about everyone and he cares about everything going on in society. And I think the fact that there are people who are struggling with this or trying to navigate this, and there are systems, I think it's important that the church embrace the conversation, because the church is supposed to be a place where people run to and they hear that God can be an answer not only to their problems that the church is used to, but maybe even problems that people in the church are not used to. Yeah, thank you.
And yeah, just agreeing with what you both said, but as well, I think just kind of the point of having this conversation is just the fact to talk about it, and for people to realize this should not be a taboo subject in the church. This is something that we can all relate to in one way or another, and that we should talk about it, and we should have these conversations and not be afraid to talk about that.
So another question I really want to ask you guys is, why now? Why do you think we're having this conversation now?
I think for me, to be honest, until all that's happened recently and what's been shown on the media in terms of race, and particularly in America, what's been going on and with the protests basically throughout the world, I don't think I realized how big of an issue racism is in today's society until that happened. And I feel like with the media, there's so much being projected, and I kind of just want to find out what is the reality of this situation, especially how do the people that we're surrounded by feel in light of what's going on? How does it affect the people that we're going to be meeting on a day-to-day basis? And just kind of personally forming my own perspective and not just seeing things through a media's point of view.
Definitely. I think to follow on from that, it is quite a historic time that we are in at the moment. It's something that will go down in the history books in light of everything that's been going on. And I think it's just an amazing opportunity to just be opening up this dialogue in every area of life. I know I've been having conversations with my friends, I've been having conversations with my family members, and the church is one of the most, if not the most important community in my life. So I'm thinking we should be having this conversation in the church and having it with our leaders and having it with our brothers and sisters. So that's my main.
Thank you. I think I definitely really agree with you guys. For me, I think why now? I would definitely say this has been something that, me and my girlfriends after class will talk about, like, when we go to the pub for food. And it's something that I discuss so much in my day-to-day life, but I've never discussed in the church. And I think as unfortunate as recent events have been, they've kind of brought it to a focus where, to be honest, I now feel more comfortable speaking about it in places because I now feel like it has given many people a platform to speak about maybe things that we were keeping in one area of our life. But now it's like, okay, so it's in the news, so I don't feel that uncomfortable about going to someone else and being like, talking about it a bit more over there.
So I was just chatting to a friend this week, and we were talking about this subject just in preparation for this conversation that we were going to have. So I'm just going to read out what they said to me, just so I quote them correctly. So they said that I did notice that even from a young age, that Black culture was never taught, despite having a large Black community within the school. And so when I was just thinking about it, I was just wondering, like, for you guys here, were you taught about the history of racial relations at school? And just to put that into context, for me in secondary school, I remember we were taught like about the slave trade, but I think the way that it was taught was very depersonalized. And so I kind of grew up with education of knowing that this was something that happened a long time ago, but not really understanding that it still affects people today from the repercussions of that. And I just wondered, from both of you going to different schools in different areas, were you taught about anything like that? And what was your experience growing up?
I would say personally, I did not grow up in a UK context, so I was born and raised in Africa. And despite it not necessarily always being in our curriculum, I think these are things that I did learn from family members, from teachers, from aunties and uncles, and even because we did like the IGCSE system as well. Everything we learned, my teachers, being Pan-Africans, would always put everything in a context of colonialism. So I grew up with a very big awareness of like race relations, slavery, and colonialism, and even neo-colonialism. So what colonialism looks like in today's society. So I think personally, I was taught it in school, and I think the question you've asked is so important because I think because we don't, I feel as though this is not really discussed in school. As people become adults, it becomes very difficult to have a conversation with them because they've never been made aware of the situation. So it's almost like to them it's something new, whereas to me it's something I've been knowing from a child's perspective. So I think that's such an important question because if we haven't learned it from a young age, it becomes more difficult to be familiar with it and to look out for it as we grow up. That makes sense?
Definitely. I think my experience is kind of links to both of yours. So I grew up in the UK, and all of my schooling I've done in the UK. And just like how Abby said, the kind of context that we're taught about race in school is kind of a little bit during history. You do about the slave trade, and then I know people who take like GCSE history. I wasn't one of those people. They learn a bit about the civil rights movement, predominantly in America. So I think that's about the extent to what we are taught in school. But like Melissa, I learned a lot from home, just from family members and from friends who would teach me about colonization, so colonization in Zimbabwe, which is where I'm from, and just kind of the different race relations that they've been exposed to growing up, and then instilling all of their lessons into me. And in general, I don't know how you guys will feel about this, but I think if you don't have a kind of base foundation from a young age being taught in school, it's so much easier for society to teach you different things. So right now, like what you were saying, Abby, this is kind of the first time that a lot of people are being exposed to situations like this. Something like the Black Lives Movement has been around for a really long time, and there have been other movements, but just now it's when it's kind of globally being more known and people are being exposed to it. So people's opinions are being so easily influenced by the media and what they see in the media. So it's almost like society now is teaching us things. And society sometimes can teach us good things, but I have seen that society can also lead us down wrong paths as well.
And I think just from what you've both said, I think where you grow up and the context in which you grow up is also really important. Because for me, like, my background is very different because I have lived in a very rural area, and to say that it's not racially diverse would be an understatement. Like, I didn't really grow up with many other people from other ethnic backgrounds. It was predominantly like a white middle class area. And so I don't think I had kind of that exposure in the past to kind of adapt and get used to things. And so I feel like for me, it wasn't until I went like on mission trips to Africa and other countries, for example, that I really was exposed to race in such a different way like that. So I feel like there are so many different areas within the UK that schools need to teach about it, because if you're from like a big city, you're going to be surrounded by loads of different people from different backgrounds. Whereas if you're in a rural area, you can be surrounded by people who are just the same as you. And so I think for everybody to kind of get that same experience, it does need to be taught in schools.
And just to go off the back of that, I do think that is really important now, especially as we're coming into a world where we're gonna have to interact with many other people. That I do think, I agree with both of you, and I think education systems do need to adjust, because it's no longer, even though I grew up like, I moved around quite a bit, but my whole life has been in various different African countries. I've now come here and like, I'm having to learn to be with Welsh people that back when I was 8, I didn't even know about Wales, but now I'm having to learn to interact with their culture. So I do think it does need to be integrated, because we're coming into a world where you're gonna grow up with people from thousands of like miles away. And I really appreciate like what you're saying, because I think it helps us understand like the different perspectives. But yeah.
Just to kind of add on, you know, where you kind of grew up influencing you a lot, because I grew up also in a predominantly white community. So I'm from Somerset. I live quite close to you, Abby. And yeah, there weren't very many Black people. I was one of maybe 4 Black children in my school, and in the church that we attended as well. We initially attended a church in London that was predominantly Black. So at that time, I didn't kind of see the effects of race relations in the church, because I was going to a predominantly Black church. But then when I was about 13, I decided to move to a different church by myself. I was invited with a friend, and I attended a predominantly white church. And it was a lovely church. The community was amazing. So many of those leaders became my mentors. I'm still in touch with so many people to this day. But what I did notice was I started to become aware of people's kind of lack of knowledge towards race within the church. So one thing is, like, when I would go to church, I would feel as if I was representing the whole Black community. I would feel like I have to act a certain way because I want people to think that I'm educated. I don't want people to think that they have to save me. I don't want people to think that I can't contribute to the church as much as other people can contribute. So yeah, I don't know if Melissa, you had that experience, or Abby.
Yeah, I definitely can agree with that. I think when I first came to the UK, I was in not even predominantly, like all white churches. And this was very different for me growing up around people that looked just like me. And I think like I did feel a bit of that like struggle. Like, you know, you'd have like conversations like rooted in love, of course, but like, oh, actually, I don't know. But let me just say, like, people would maybe, like, you know, have certain viewpoints of things like, you know, how come you speak English so well? Or, you know, you go to a place and, like, everybody's touching your hair and you're kind of thinking, why is everybody petting my hair? What is going on? Like, you know, and just small things like that I would say that we don't maybe understand. Maybe they're not necessarily rooted in just trying to understand, where does that come from? Like, where does that, that maybe unconscious bias, and maybe just having a conversation about not only what does it look like, I think to go away from what does it look like on the outside, but how does it make the individual feel? And I think just starting to look at, how do our ethnically, like, people who are different than you, how would they feel when you approach them with a kind of, and I think that's what I want to maybe get more into thinking. Like, sometimes we think about the broad, like, how will this look to other people? No, but it's about thinking before we do the small things. Like, if I come and I pet her hair, like, how is she going to feel? If I ask her, why does she know English? How is she going to feel? Just things like that. I think, yeah, I don't know if I've drifted or if I've answered your question, but yeah, I think I have.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And it just reminded me of a story, Kim. So a couple of years ago, I have a friend who's from Mozambique, and so she's mixed race. And I grew up in like a very small village church, and I took her there one day. And I remember before we went, she said, "Have they ever seen a black person in this church?" And she was kind of just like joking about it, but then it just made me feel, I wonder how you feel when you are the only person in that situation. If you are the only person in a white crowd, you're the only black person, like, how would that make you feel? And it reminded me as well when I went to India 2 years ago. And honestly, I was in Delhi, and everywhere I went, I just stood out so much. And I was just always the center of attention. And in that context, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because like people wanted to come and talk to me and come and see me because I was different to them. But it does make you feel self-conscious when you know people are looking at you. And so I just wonder, Kim, like for you, when you said that you felt like you were representing the black people within that church community, how did that make you feel? Were you self-conscious of that? Was it a good thing, or did you struggle with it?
I would definitely say that it's something that makes you feel self-conscious. I guess for me, my experience might differ from other people because I was already used to kind of attending white communities. I went to a predominantly white school. So it almost just became my natural persona. Like I would just slip into that role. But it does make you feel like you're being hyper analyzed. Maybe you're not being hyper analyzed. I think most people probably aren't hyper analyzing, but it does make you feel like your every move is being watched. You want to be on your best behavior. Like I would see some of my friends kind of acting up in church. When you're a kid, like they'll go and they'll run around or they'll talk loudly and they'll get shushed. But I always felt that I couldn't be the person to do that because I felt I would be letting down every other black person that might come before me.
I really find it interesting what you said, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of it has to go back to Abby's earlier question of the education, because we've grown up learning that there are certain viewpoints or certain stereotypes that are attached to us as black people. It makes us always think about it, or I don't want to speak for everyone, but me personally, if I know that this is how maybe black people have been perceived, I go into a situation wanting to be the opposite of what you think that I'm going to be. Like if it's a negative stereotype, I'm always on my toes to try and be better. And that I think that might be a pressure that someone doesn't necessarily, they're not aware of or they don't know of if they've not been taught that. And I don't know if it's the being taught it that made it. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's true. I think like just going back to what you said before about feelings, and it's not necessarily about like the slave trade, what happened, or like learning about those things, but it's more considering how do people feel when they're in that situation. And I feel like that's probably more what needs to be taught. Just yeah, like so people aren't singled out, and it's about treating everybody as individuals regardless of where they come from. We're all people, we all have feelings, and it's just knowing that you're not different because of your skin color or your background. You still feel things in the same way.
Definitely. So the three of us, we have conversations like this all the time, and we have them so easily with one another. But I just wanted to ask you guys, do you find it difficult or scary to have conversations about race within the church, with other people, with other members of the church, the community, or the leaders, or even just in general?
That is a very good question. I think for me, probably, I do feel comfortable having these kind of conversations, and I think that's partly to do with the fact that I have so many friends from like different places, and I've been to different places and kind of had that exposure and just experience of talking to different types of people. But I think what I do find challenging sometimes is starting the conversation and just knowing how to bring certain things up. So if somebody approaches me, I would be comfortable talking to them, but I don't know if I would be comfortable approaching somebody else, because I would feel like, I don't know, maybe they don't want to talk about it, or they something like that. I think starting conversations is a lot harder.
I agree with Abby. I think that's a really good question. Personally, I would say that outside the church, I am not uncomfortable having this conversation. Like in classrooms, like when they bring up racism, I'm always the first person to be like, sir, like, you know, and in small tutorial groups with my friends from a very young age, this is a conversation I love to have. But I think I've not been able to have this conversation in the church. For me, personally, it's been because of personal experiences. And I think it's important to remember that for me, that the church is made up of individuals. So just because I've approached an individual and they've had a certain perspective, I think it kind of made me think, oh, this is the perspective of the church. And maybe just learning that, no, that's the perspective of the individual. But I think I have struggled to have the conversation in a church setting, because majority of the time, since I have started coming to church, I've been the only Black person there, or maybe one of the only few, and I'm not really sure, will they understand me? Will they listen? And I think maybe I've had like scenarios where I've brought the conversation up, and maybe others were uncomfortable, so they didn't say anything. So it made me feel like, okay, this is taboo. This is not to be talked about. So that's just my own personal experience.
Thank you, girls. I guess to add my own 2 cents into it, I would say that, kind of like Abby, I'm not. It's a yes and a no. It's a no because I am someone who is comfortable having these conversations. I have them regularly. You know, you guys, I often will just bring this up in casual conversation. And it's the same with a lot of my friends, even strangers. I'm comfortable just kind of bringing up the conversation of race in our society with them. But where I am scared is the results of the conversation. So I'm scared that we're just going to be talking and nothing is going to be happening. I'm scared that I'll be defined by this conversation and I'll be defined by my opinions. I'm scared that I'll define other people by their opinions. I'm scared that the results of this conversation, or any change, will be, the responsibility of that will be put completely on me, and not the other person that is involved in this dialogue, or that I'll put the responsibility on the other person and not do anything for myself. So that's where the majority of my fears kind of lie in.
Yeah, that's a good point. And to be honest, I hadn't really considered that before that you mentioned it, but it just made me think, like, why are we bringing up the conversations? If we know why we're starting the conversation and where we want to go with that, I think that kind of can give us the confidence that we need to approach people and to talk about it. And ultimately, our goal should be just about creating unity and just giving people freedom to be who they are and to not feel judged by that. So yeah, if we know why we're speaking about it, I think it can make it a lot easier for us to speak.
So I guess just to kind of end up with the last question for you guys, how does racism present itself in our society today?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a very important question. I think when we talk racism, a lot of people maybe expect that it will be like, you know, you have to see somebody in the back whipping somebody, or, you know, you have to, like, we just think of slave ships and we say, well, there are no slave ships, so there's no slavery, or there's no racism, pardon me. So I think it's about, so sorry, my brain froze like halfway through answering that question. I think the way we see racism today is, number one, in institutions. Whether you're looking at the justice system, whether you're looking at, you know, education systems, and there's a lot of research behind that. So I think I would really encourage people, don't be ignorant. Like, don't just sit down and say, oh, well, I haven't seen it. Like, just because you can't see something doesn't mean it's not there. Like, you know, it's, we're not going to stop all believing because a few people can't see something. So I would say, please, like, educate yourself. And this doesn't matter where your background is from. You could be Black, you could be white, you could be from any other community, and maybe you don't understand this conversation. I would say research, because going back to what you said, Kim, in the beginning, like, injustice is at the heart of what Christianity is about. So I think understand that it could be even unconscious biases, or like it could be you go to a supermarket and you're seeing a side comment by someone said to your friend. It could be even in the media industry, you know, the way they are promoting one type of beauty, you know, and leaving every other, you know, person of color, or, you know, out of that idea of beauty. So I think it presents itself in many ways.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said, Melissa, particularly about unconscious biases. And so I think when we think about the history of Black and white people, it's something that goes back so far. And like, there must be so much hurt and pain behind everything that has gone on in the past. And I think that kind of unforgiveness or that kind of tension can be passed down through generations. And so it may not be something that we think of as a big issue in society, because like you said, there isn't, well, there probably is world slavery actually at the moment, but it's not seen in the way that it was in the past. And so we feel like the issue is kind of resolved, but it doesn't mean that the underlying issues have actually been resolved, that, you know, people have forgiven what has gone on before. And I think we can often have unconscious biases that we don't realize are there, but with something that is so deep rooted, I feel like it's kind of inevitable that there's going to be repercussions of that into society today.
I definitely agree with everything that you guys have said. The only thing that I would add on is sometimes I feel like it can go the other way. So the kind of attitude of, oh, I don't see color. When you meet someone and they say, oh, I don't see color. And Melissa, you said something funny the other day where you said, but why, if you don't see color, why are you saying this to me? Do you say that to everyone that you meet, whether they're white, Black, whatever? So it's evident that we do see color. A lot of the institutions of the world, they are based on race. Two of us are medical students, one of us is a law student. We see that in our own career paths, like what you said, Melissa, when it comes to institutional racism. And it has a role in society. Race has a role in society. Culture has a role in society. And by not acknowledging that, that could actually be racist, because you could be silencing groups of individuals. You could be diminishing someone's experience, and that could also have a negative impact. Thank you, Abby. So yeah, I think it's important for us to have these conversations and to bring this to light about the different presentations that we see in society, because a lot of the things that we mentioned, they're micro. They're things that if you weren't looking for it, you wouldn't notice it. So it's just making ourselves aware, educating ourselves so that we do pick up on it when it comes.
Yeah, I think that was a really, really good point, Kim. Thank you so much for making that. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we're going to need to draw this conversation to a close. But we just hope that with all that we've shared today, that it can kind of stir up conversations for other people and just really get you thinking about the issues of race and how that is presented in the world as we see it right now. So thank you both for sharing, and hopefully everybody will join us for next week's episode, which is going to be called Breaking Down Culture Barriers with the Gospel. So I'm excited for that. And I just want to invite Melissa just to end us with a really short prayer. That's okay.
Yes. So, dear Jesus, thank you so much that we've been able to meet here. Thank you for the conversation that we've been able to have. I just pray, Lord God, that you would just help us to open our hearts and our minds to this issue more. Help us to see your heart for this and for society. And we just love you and we praise you and we thank you that you love all of us equally and the same. We love you so much, Jesus. Amen.